I just returned to Annapolis after 17 years serving in the Navy. My sister, Megan, threw a stack of papers in my face and hissed, "You're the family's shame. Don't even think about touching this house." She didn't know who the soldier she just insulted really was and what she was capable of. My name is Tessa Harden. I am 39 years old, a commander in the United States Navy, and for the first time in 17 years I was home. The taxi pulled away, leaving me standing on the historic brick-paved street of Annapolis. The crisp late September air carried the familiar, briny scent of the Chesapeake Bay, a smell I had yearned for in the sterile confines of naval bases and the metallic hulls of warships across the globe. It was the scent of steamed blue crabs seasoned with Old Bay, of salt marshes at low tide, of a childhood I desperately wanted to reconnect with. My summer white uniform, stark and pristine, felt out of place here, a ghost from another world. But in my heart, a stubborn hope flickered. This was it. This was my return. I stood before my grandfather's house, a proud 2-story colonial, built of resolute red brick, a fortress of memories. He had always called it my harbor, a safe port in any storm. But the harbor was closed today. The black wrought iron gate, usually open in a welcoming gesture, was shut and padlocked. A new, sleek security camera swiveled towards me, its glass eye cold and analytical, tracking my every move. It wasn't a welcome, it was a warning. The hope that had carried me across continents began to sink, a ship losing its anchor in a sudden, violent squall. I clutched the handle of my duffel bag, the canvas worn from years of travel, and took a hesitant step forward, my polished black shoes silent on the old bricks. The silence was heavy, broken only by the cry of a distant gull and the thudding of my own heart against my ribs. The front door swung open, not with the warmth I had imagined, but with the force of a slammed bulkhead. My sister Megan stood framed in the doorway. She was the picture of Annapolis success, her tailored navy blue business dress as rigid and unyielding as her posture. There was no hug, no smile. Instead, she held a thick manila folder, and with a flick of her wrist, she tossed it onto the sidewalk. It landed at my feet with a dull, final thud. "This is a restraining order, Tessa," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You are not to come within 500 feet of this property." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at her, then at the folder, the official-looking papers, mocking me from the ground. "What are you talking about, Megan?" I managed to ask, my voice a dry whisper. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "What am I talking about? Who do you think you are, showing up here in that costume? You are an embarrassment to this family." She gestured dismissively at my uniform, at the ribbons on my chest that represented years of sacrifice. A 39-year-old spinster who plays with guns and lives on a ship. This is Annapolis, Tessa. This is a town for decent, respectable families, not for whatever it is you've become. Each word was a calculated strike, a perfectly aimed bullet hitting its mark, shattering the fragile hope I had carried home. The metals on my chest suddenly felt like lead weights, pulling me down into a sea of shame. I looked past her, searching for an ally, a friendly face, and then I saw him. My father, Robert, stood in the shadows of the hallway behind Megan. He was thinner than I remembered, his shoulders slumped. "Dad?" The word escaped my lips, a plea for reason, for a sliver of the fatherly protection I had read about but never truly known. He met my gaze for a fleeting second, his eyes filled with a familiar avoidance, before looking away at a point on the far wall. "Listen to your sister, Tessa," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Things are different now. There's no place for you here. His silence, his refusal to defend me, was a betrayal more profound than Megan's venom. It was the final crushing blow. Just then, a police car glided to a stop at the curb. An older officer stepped out, his expression tired. He saw my uniform, the rank on my collar, and for a moment he hesitated. "Commander Hardin," he said, his voice laced with a professional regret that offered no comfort. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I have to ask you to leave the premises." He didn't have to. I was already backing away, my polished shoes scuffing on the pavement. Each step felt like a retreat from a battle I hadn't even known I was fighting. I, Commander Tessa Hardin, who had never shed a tear in the face of enemy fire, felt a hot, stinging trail burn its way down my cheek. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was my history, my identity, and they had locked me out. They had turned me into a stranger on my own soil, an enemy at my own gate. Why? After everything I had done, why? The question from yesterday echoed in the stale air of the cheap motel room. Why? The word hung there, a ghost in the dim light. And it pulled me back through time, back to the source of the rot. The answer, I realized, had always been there, written in the silences and the sideways glances of my childhood. I remember the day the letter came, the thick envelope with the seal of the United States Naval Academy. I was 17, and that letter was my world, my validation. I ran into the living room, waving it like a trophy, my heart pounding with a pride so pure it felt like it would burst. My mother was arranging flowers on the mantelpiece. She sighed, a long, weary sound, and didn't turn around. "Oh, Tessa," she murmured, "all the other girls are thinking about business school, maybe law, something respectable." My father, Robert, was sunk into his favorite armchair, hidden behind the rustling pages of the Capital Gazette. He lowered the paper just enough for me to see his eyes over the rim of his reading glasses, held my gaze for a beat, and then raised it again. Not a word, not a nod, nothing. His silence was a verdict, a declaration that my greatest achievement wasn't even worth acknowledging. It was a path he didn't approve of, a future he refused to see. Only Megan spoke, her voice dripping with the casual cruelty of a favored child. "Oh, look, everyone, it's G.I. Jane," she sneered from the sofa, scrolling through her phone. "Good luck finding a husband in a sea of sailors." In that room, surrounded by my family, I had never felt more alone. But there was one who saw me. My grandfather, a retired Navy man who had served on carriers during the Cold War, was my true north. He found me later on the back porch, the one that overlooked the Chesapeake Bay, where the air smelled of salt and freedom. He put a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. "Don't you listen to them, Tessa," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "The sea is in the Hardin blood. You're my legacy, kid, my pride." His words were a lifeline. The day I left for the academy, he pressed a sealed manila envelope into my hands. "This is a copy of my will," he whispered, his eyes serious. "This house, this harbor, it's yours. I know you'll be the one to keep it safe. It's a soldier's promise." That envelope, and the promise it held, became my lighthouse. Through the grueling years at the academy, through lonely deployments and dangerous missions, it was the beacon that guided me, a reminder that I had a port to return to. I remembered Admiral McRaven's famous speech, the one we all had to watch. "If you want to change the world, start off by making your bed." I had made my bed every single day with military precision. I thought I was changing my world. I never imagined the foundation of that world, my own family, was rotting from within. The next morning, a sliver of desperate resolve cut through the fog of my grief. There had to be an explanation, a mistake. I drove to the family lawyer's office downtown, a stuffy place with dark wood paneling and the smell of old paper. Mr. Abernathy, a friend of my father's, greeted me with a discomfort he barely tried to hide. I sat across from his large mahogany desk, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "Mr. Abernathy," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need to see a copy of my grandfather's will, the original one." He cleared his throat, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He shuffled some papers, avoiding my eyes. "Ah, yes, the Hardin estate," he said, his tone overly formal. "Well, Commander, that will was updated about 5 years ago." He pulled out a document from a folder. According to the most recent legally binding will, the entire estate, including the house on Chesapeake Avenue, was left to your sister, Mrs. Megan Caldwell. The room tilted. The air rushed out of my lungs. "But that's impossible. My grandfather promised me. I have a copy." "A copy is not the final document," he interrupted, his voice cold and final. "This will was properly executed and notarized. Your father, Robert Hardin, was present as a witness." A witness? My father was a witness to the shredding of my grandfather's promise. He had stood by and watched as they erased me, as they scuttled the one safe harbor I had ever known. The soldier's promise was broken, not by an enemy, but by his own son, by my own father. I sat there, frozen in the stiff leather chair, the lawyer's words ringing in my ears. The one pure, unwavering belief I had held on to for 17 years had just been annihilated. Have you ever put your entire faith in a single promise, only to discover that the person you loved most was the one willing to betray it? I left the lawyer's office feeling adrift, unmoored from the last anchor of my past. The question from the night before returned, sharper this time. If my grandfather's promise was worthless, then what was my own path, my 17 years of service, worth? To answer that, I had to look back, not at them, but at the woman their indifference had forged. My entire adult life had been a series of departures and deployments, each one a silent promise to myself that the sacrifice would be meaningful. I thought of my first Christmas deployed in the Persian Gulf, the air thick with sand and the tension of a potential conflict. While my family was gathered back in Annapolis, surrounded by the scent of roast turkey and pumpkin pie, my world was the low hum of the ship's engine and the metallic taste of coffee from the mess hall. Megan had emailed a picture of them all, smiling in front of a roaring fireplace, wearing the ugly Christmas sweaters Mom knitted every year. They were a perfect portrait of American family life. My present to them, a hand-carved wooden box I'd spent hours haggling for in a dusty market in Bahrain, was nowhere in sight. I stared at their smiling faces on my small laptop screen, the only light in my dark cabin, and felt a profound, bottomless loneliness that the vast ocean outside couldn't rival. My mother's reply to my holiday email, when it finally came weeks later, was a few short lines. "Hope you're well. When are you getting tired of all this and coming home for good?" Megan's kids miss their aunt, you know. They never asked about the danger, about the long watches staring at screens, for any sign of a cyber attack. They never asked about the friends I'd made or the ones I'd lost. To them, my career wasn't a service. It was a strange, prolonged phase. An inconvenient hobby that kept me away from family portraits. It was something to be endured until I finally came to my senses. Years bled into one another, marked not by seasons, but by the locations of my deployments. I missed my niece's baptism, my cousin's wedding, my aunt's funeral. I sent gifts from ports I could barely pronounce. A silk scarf from Japan, a leather-bound journal from Italy, each one a small, desperate attempt to weave myself back into the family tapestry, to remind them I still existed. Each gift was met with a brief, polite thank you text, or more often, a complete and total silence. The silence was the worst. It was a cold, empty void that I learned to fill with work, with duty, with the unwavering logic of the mission. I remembered the day I made commander. It was a monumental achievement, the culmination of years of sleepless nights at Fort Meade, battling unseen enemies in the digital ether. It was a rank that commanded respect, a symbol of everything I had poured my life into. I had driven back to my small empty apartment near the base, the new gleaming rank insignia heavy in my hand. I stood alone in my Spartan living room, looking at my reflection in the dark television screen. There was pride, yes, a fierce, burning pride, but it was a solitary pride, an achievement with no one to share it with. With a surge of hope I should have known better than to feel, I called home, my voice buoyant. "Mom, Dad, I made commander." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence so pregnant it felt like an accusation. Then my mother's voice, distracted, as if I had interrupted something far more important. "Oh, that's nice, dear. Say, did we tell you Megan just got a new Lexus? It's a beautiful pearl white." She took us for a drive down to the city dock. Just like that, my news, my 17 years of relentless effort, was swept aside, deemed less interesting than a new luxury car. My promotion, a testament to my dedication and skill, was reduced to a footnote in the grand, important story of my sister's material possessions. That coldness, that constant, casual dismissal, should have broken me. It should have sent me spiraling, but it didn't. It hardened me. It forged a discipline in me that my peers, with their warm family calls and weekend visits, couldn't match. At Fleet Cyber Command, I became one of the best because I had nothing else. No distractions, no long, loving phone calls, no romantic getaways to plan. I had the mission. The void my family left was filled with cryptographic keys, threat assessments, and the unwavering logic of code. Their absence became my armor. I grew strong, not because of them, but in spite of them. I built a life, a career, and a reputation on the very foundation of their neglect. But now, standing metaphorically on the cold pavement outside my childhood home, that armor felt thin and brittle. The strength I had built in isolation was being tested in a way I had never anticipated. It was a strength designed for foreign threats, for digital ghosts in the machine. But was that strength enough to fight a war where the enemy wasn't a distant state actor, but my own blood? Was the discipline that helped me protect a nation enough to protect my own heart from the people who were supposed to be its first line of defense? I didn't know. For the first time in a long, long time, I truly didn't know. Sitting alone in the rented sedan, staring out at the gray, choppy waters of the Chesapeake Bay, the question from the night before felt like a physical weight. Was my strength enough? The answer was a stark and terrifying no. Not for this kind of war. The skills that made me a formidable officer, analysis, strategy, emotional detachment, were useless against the insidious poison of family betrayal. For the first time, I felt truly out of my depth, a ship without a crew, adrift in a storm I couldn't navigate alone. My hand trembled as I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over a number I knew by heart, a number I hadn't called in months. I pressed it. "Jess, it's me, Tessa." My voice, usually so steady and controlled, cracked on the last word. There was a beat of silence, then an explosion of concern on the other end. "Tessa, oh my God, where are you? What's wrong? You sound awful." Jessica Ross, my best friend since our college days at the University of Maryland, now a top litigator in Baltimore. Her voice was a jolt of fierce, unwavering loyalty. In a few short, clipped sentences, I laid out the whole ugly story: the gate, the restraining order, the will. Jessica listened without interruption, a skill that made her a terror in the courtroom. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then her voice returned, no longer just concerned, but cold as steel. "Okay, meet me at Cantler's in an hour. Don't talk to anyone else in your family. Don't answer their calls. And call Leo Vance. Tell him to meet us there. Now." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, a protective, commanding order. And it was the most comforting sound I had heard in 17 years. For the first time since I'd stepped out of that taxi, I felt a flicker of something other than pain. I felt like I had a first mate. Cantler's Riverside Inn was exactly as I remembered it, loud, unpretentious, and smelling gloriously of steamed crab and melted butter. The wooden deck was crowded with families cracking open shells with wooden mallets, their laughter echoing over the water. It was a scene of normal, happy life that felt a million miles away from my reality. But our table, tucked away in a corner, was a war room. Jessica had her leather briefcase open, a yellow legal pad already filled with notes. Leo Vance, my former Navy colleague, was already there, nursing a cold bottle of beer. His face was as rugged and weathered as a ship's hull, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He'd left the NCIS to become a private security consultant, and he was the best investigator I knew. I didn't need to rehash the story. I just slid the copy of my grandfather's will across the paper-covered table. Jessica picked it up, her perfectly manicured nails tapping the edge of the paper as she read. Her brow furrowed. "This notary's signature, it feels off. I'm going to run a check on his license." Leo barely glanced at it. He leaned forward, his voice low. "Tessa, I did a preliminary search on the way over. There are no major medical filings for your father. No scheduled heart surgeries, but your brother-in-law, Derek, his company, Vanguard Logistics, is leveraged to the hilt. He's drowning in debt." He looked me straight in the eye. "This is about more than a house." They didn't ask me how I felt. They didn't coddle me. They asked, "What's the plan?" They saw me not as a victim, but as a commander who needed her tactical team. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Jessica flipped open her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Okay, here's our initial strategy. Step 1. I'm filing for an immediate injunction to freeze any and all transactions related to the property. That means they can't sell it, they can't lease it, they can't even remortgage it. We put a wall around it, effective immediately." She paused, her eyes locking with mine. "Step 2. I'm filing a petition to challenge the validity of this new will based on suspected fraud and undue influence. We'll demand a forensic analysis of the signature." She gave a grim smile. "They think you're just a lone soldier, Tessa. They're wrong. You have air support now." Leo put a reassuring hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and steady. "And you've got ground intel," he added. "I'm going to do a deep dive on Derek and Vanguard Logistics, financials, contracts, shell corporations. In our world, there are no perfect secrets, just sloppy cover-ups. I'll find the loose thread." For the first time in days, a genuine breath filled my lungs. The crushing weight of isolation began to lift. replaced by a surge of defiant hope. My harbor wasn't that brick house on the bay. It was this table. It was these people, my chosen family, who without a moment's hesitation were ready to sail into the fiercest storm with me. The battle had just begun, and finally I wasn't fighting it alone. The meeting with Jessica and Leo had been a shot of adrenaline, a dose of pure, undiluted hope. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I wasn't just reacting, I was planning. I had a team, I had a strategy. A fragile sense of control began to replace the raw, gaping wound of betrayal. But I should have known my family wouldn't remain passive. They had been fighting a covert war against me for years, a war of attrition on my self-worth. Now that I had declared my own intentions to fight back, they simply shifted their tactics from cold dismissal to a more insidious form of combat. Emotional warfare. The assault came not with overt aggression, but with the cloying, poisonous weapons of guilt and feigned affection. It began with a call from my father a few days after Jessica filed the injunction. I saw his name on the caller ID, and my stomach immediately tightened into a cold, hard knot. His voice, when I answered, was nothing like the flat, dismissive tone I was used to. It was frail, raspy, and deliberately weak, a performance worthy of a stage actor. "Tessa, honey, it's Dad." Honey. He hadn't called me that since I was a child learning to ride a bike. "I know you're angry, you have every right to be, but I need you to listen. The doctors, they say my heart is in bad shape. They need to operate soon." He punctuated the sentence with a series of shallow theatrical coughs that sounded painfully rehearsed. "We need the money from the house, Tessa. You can't let your old man die over a piece of property, can you? You've been gone for 17 years. What does that house even mean to you anymore? Just be a good daughter, Tessa. Think about your family." He was casting me as the villain in his fabricated medical drama, the cold, heartless daughter willing to let her own father perish for the sake of bricks and mortar. He was twisting the very concept of family into a bludgeon, trying to shame me into submission. A cold fury settled in my gut. I remembered something I'd seen in a Brené Brown talk online during a long, lonely deployment. Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. My family had been disappointing me my entire life. It was time to stop disappointing myself. I said nothing, just a quiet, "I'll have my lawyer look into it, Dad," and hung up. The silence on my end, a new, unfamiliar boundary he wasn't prepared for. Their next move was more personal, an ambush of sentimentality. A few days later, as I sat in my rental car outside Jessica's office in Baltimore, reviewing case notes, a familiar Lexus SUV pulled up. My mother got out. She looked older up close, her face etched with a worry that I knew instinctively was not for me. She tapped on my window, and I reluctantly rolled it down. "Tessa, we need to talk," she said, her eyes puffy and red. She held out a tin box of her homemade oatmeal raisin cookies, my childhood favorite. The smell instantly transporting me back to a simpler, more innocent time. The gesture was so transparent, it was insulting. "I know things are tense between you and Megan," she began, her voice a pleading whisper. "But Derek is a good son-in-law. He's done so much for us, for your father. His business is just going through a rough patch. We're a family, Tessa. We're supposed to help each other, to lift each other up." She reached through the window and grabbed my hand. Her skin was cold, her grip surprisingly strong, a desperate anchor. "Please, just drop the lawsuit. Don't take this any further. Think of what this is doing to your father. I'm begging you." She was using love as a shield for their crimes, offering cookies as a bribe for justice. The warmth of the tin box felt like a brand on my skin, a symbol of a love that was conditional and manipulative. I gently pushed it back towards her. "I can't do that, Mom," I said, my voice barely audible. I could see the flicker of calculation in her eyes before the tears started to well up again, right on cue. The final and most direct attack came that night. It was an email from Derek. The subject line read, "A friendly piece of advice." My blood ran cold before I even opened it. His tone was slick and condescending, the digital equivalent of a smug, unsolicited pat on the head. "Tessa," it began, "I understand you're upset, but let's be pragmatic. I know you work for Fleet Cyber Command. A sensitive position like that, requiring a top-secret security clearance, depends on a clean record and a family without complications." The threat was veiled but unmistakable, as sharp as a stiletto. "Are you sure you want to drag your family's name through a messy public lawsuit? It could have unforeseen consequences for your next security review. Think about the career you've worked so hard to build. It would be a shame to see it all go away." It wasn't advice, it was blackmail. He was holding my career, my honor, the very core of my identity, hostage. He was threatening to destroy the one thing I had built for myself, the one thing they could never touch. The simmering anger I had been suppressing for days, the quiet fury I had kept locked down, finally boiled over. This wasn't about a house anymore. This wasn't even about a broken promise. They had crossed a line. They had targeted my service, my uniform, my oath. And in doing so, they had just made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of their lives. I stared at the screen, reading Derek's email for the third, then fourth time. The words on the glowing display seemed to pulse with a smug, condescending rhythm. "Think about the career you've worked so hard to build. It would be a shame to see it all go away." It wasn't just a threat against me, Tessa Hardin, the forgotten daughter. It was a direct assault against Commander Hardin, United States Navy. A threat against the uniform I wore with pride, the oath I had taken with solemn sincerity, and the 17 years of my life I had poured into serving my country, a service they had never once tried to understand. He was using my loyalty, the very bedrock of my existence, as a weapon against me. He was holding my honor hostage. And in that moment, something inside me, something I had kept locked down for decades, finally snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, definitive fracture, like a hairline crack in a ship's hull that suddenly gives way under immense pressure. The carefully constructed dams of patience, of familial obligation, of the desperate childish hope that one day they might finally see me, crumbled into dust. A fury, cold and pure and utterly focused, surged through me. It was a clean fire, burning away all the hurt, all the sadness, all the desperate longing for their approval. I threw my phone onto the cheap motel bedspread, the impact startlingly loud in the oppressive silence of the room. All the slights, the dismissals, the Christmases alone, the promotions met with indifference, the years of being made to feel small and insignificant. It all coalesced into this one unbearable act of contempt. They had taken my grandfather's house. They had spat on his memory, and now they were trying to strip me of the one thing that was entirely my own. No, not this time. There would be no more quiet suffering, no more swallowing my pain, for the sake of a family that didn't exist outside of a legal definition. The limit had been reached and irrevocably breached. The time for silent endurance was over. This was no longer a fight over a house. This was no longer a squabble over an inheritance. This was a fight for justice. This was a fight for my soul. I walked to the cheap particle board desk where I had placed a small American flag in a plastic stand, a habit from years of living in transient quarters around the world. I looked at the 50 white stars on their field of blue, the 13 red and white stripes, and I remembered my commissioning oath, the words I had spoken with a trembling, earnest voice those years ago on the grounds of the Naval Academy, that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I had always imagined those enemies as foreign powers, as faceless threats on a computer screen. I never imagined they would share my last name, that they would sit at the same Thanksgiving table I was never invited to. But a threat to the integrity of a commissioned officer, a threat to blackmail them over their service. That was a domestic threat to the very values I had sworn my life to uphold. I went into the bathroom and stood before the small water-stained mirror, my hands braced on the sink. I looked past the tired lines around my eyes, the exhaustion of the past few weeks. I didn't see a weary, wounded woman anymore. I saw a commander in the United States Navy. I saw the discipline etched into my posture, the resolve forged in the crucible of countless challenges. I leaned in close, my breath fogging the glass, and met my own gaze. My eyes were clear, the conflict gone, replaced by an icy calm. "You are Tessa Hardin," I said aloud, my voice low and steady, a command to myself. "You have faced down some of the most sophisticated state-sponsored hackers in the world. You have operated in war zones where a single mistake meant death. You will not be broken by these petty, grasping grifters, even if they are your own blood." I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the cold resolve spread through my limbs, sharpening my thoughts. The soldier's promise my grandfather made to me had been broken by his own son. But my own oath, the one I made to my country and to myself, would not be. Today I would defend it. I would defend the truth. I would defend my grandfather's legacy. And I would defend myself. I walked back to the bed, picked up my phone, and my fingers moved with swift, deliberate purpose. No more hesitation. No more second-guessing. First, I called Leo. "Leo, it's Tessa. The mission has changed. We are now in a full-spectrum dominance phase. I want everything you can find on Derek Caldwell and Vanguard Logistics. I want every transaction, every email, every phone record. I want to know who he had lunch with last Tuesday. Leave no stone unturned, and I want a full background check on the notary who signed that fraudulent will. I want to know where his skeletons are buried." Next, I dialed Jessica. "Jess," I said, my voice crisp and commanding, "get ready, we're going on the offensive. This is no longer just about getting the house back. This is about exposure. We are going to bring them into the light. All of them, for everything." There was no more conflict. There was no more pity. There was no more of the debilitating, lifelong need for their love. There was only the mission. Operation Justice was a go, and as its commanding officer, I would not fail. The days that followed were a blur of caffeine and encrypted data. The cheap motel room, with its lingering smell of disinfectant and regret, transformed into my own personal command center. My military-grade, encrypted laptop became my weapon system, its screen a constant portal to a secure video link with Chloe Park, a young, brilliant hacker Leo had brought onto our team. She went by the call sign Kestrel, and her fingers moved across her keyboard with the fluid grace of a concert pianist composing a symphony of digital infiltration. On the wall above the sagging motel bed, I had taped up a mind map, a sprawling web of deceit connecting names with thick red marker: Megan, Robert, Derek, Vanguard Logistics, Triton Marine Solutions. The smell of stale, burnt coffee from the 24-hour diner next door replaced the scent of my own tears. I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was an intelligence officer on the most personal mission of my life. Every click of the mouse, every command line I executed, was a deliberate step closer to the truth, a brick in the wall of justice I was building against them. The first breakthrough came from Kestrel, late one night when the rest of the world was asleep. Her voice, clear and sharp with the thrill of discovery, crackled through my laptop speakers. "Tessa, I've got something," the forged signature on the deed transfer for the house. It was scanned from a multifunction printer. Amateurs always forget about metadata, the digital fingerprint left on every file. I leaned closer to my screen, my eyes tracing the lines of code she was highlighting. Based on the hidden EXIF data embedded in the image file, I traced its source IP address. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the moment hang in the air. Guess where it came from? The primary network at Megan Caldwell's real estate office on Main Street. A cold, grim smile touched my lips. She had done it herself. She was so arrogant, so insulated by her perceived local status, and so sure I would never fight back, that she used her own office equipment to commit a felony. At the same time, an encrypted file arrived from Leo. The subject line was one word: pay dirt. Inside was a meticulously detailed spreadsheet, a roadmap of their greed. "This is Vanguard's money trail," he explained over our secure line, his voice a low growl. "Derek's been funneling significant amounts of money from his business account into a shell corporation registered in Delaware, a classic move to obscure ownership." A few days later, the exact same amounts, minus a small processing fee, were transferred to Megan's personal savings account, disguised as consulting fees or real estate commissions. "They're laundering money, Tessa. It's a classic, blatant scheme. They must have thought no one would ever look, that their family name would protect them. They had underestimated me. They had seen a grieving, lonely spinster, not a trained analyst who had spent her career hunting for needles in digital haystacks. Their contempt for me had made them sloppy, but the final, most damning piece of evidence came from my own area of expertise. It was the piece that elevated this from a sordid family drama to something far more serious, something that threatened the very institution I had served. Late into the third night, fueled by black coffee and a burning sense of purpose, I dove into the public access databases for federal government contracts, a place I knew as well as my own reflection. I found what I was looking for. Triton Marine Solutions, Derek's company, had recently won a lucrative contract to supply specialized electronic components for Navy surveillance drones. It was a contract that should have been impossible for a small, struggling company like his to win, requiring a level of security and technical verification he couldn't possibly possess. As I dug into the proposal documents, my heart began to pound with a heavy, sickening rhythm. In their application, they had listed several advanced cybersecurity certifications to prove their capability. Certifications so specific and high-level that only a handful of cleared personnel, including myself, would have access to their unclassified descriptions and application standards. He had stolen my professional identity. He had used my credentials, my reputation, my service to legitimize his fraudulent bid. My hands were shaking, but my mind was razor-sharp. I ran the serial numbers of the components listed in his contract him through a restricted, cross-referenced database I still had access to from my time at Fleet Cyber. A match, a direct, undeniable match. The numbers corresponded to a batch of components that had been reported lost in transit during an audit while I was deployed in the Persian Gulf 3 years prior. They hadn't been lost, they had been stolen, diverted, and now they were being sold back to the Navy through my brother-in-law's company, likely at a grossly inflated price. This was no longer just fraud. This was a potential breach of national security, a conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. I immediately compiled the data into a secure, time-stamped report and sent it to Jessica. She called me within minutes, her voice stripped of its usual warmth, now cold with legal fury. "Tessa, this is beyond anything I imagined. Forgery, wire fraud, money laundering, and now this. This is a pattern of organized criminal activity." She took a deep, audible breath. "This isn't just a lawsuit anymore. Tessa, we might be looking at a RICO case, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a federal law designed to take down the mob, to dismantle criminal enterprises. And now it was aimed squarely at my family." The courtroom was cold and impersonal, all polished wood and muted colors, designed to strip emotion from the proceedings. I sat beside Jessica, my back ramrod straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Across the aisle, my family and their lawyer took their seats. They were a picture of curated victimhood. Megan was dressed in an elegant cream-colored suit, her expression one of weary concern, as if she were a respectable businesswoman, forced to deal with a regrettable family matter. My father, Robert, looked frail and downtrodden, leaning on my brother-in-law Derek for support. Derek himself looked smug, his expensive tie perfectly knotted, whispering confidently to their attorney. They thought this was their stage, their narrative to control. They were about to learn that the battlefield had changed. Their lawyer, a man with silver hair and an overly confident smile, began first. He painted a masterful, heartbreaking picture for the judge. He spoke of a loving, close-knit family, a pillar of the Annapolis community. He described a hard-working sister, Megan, who had stayed home to care for their aging parents. He spoke of a sick father, his voice filled with sympathy. Then he turned his attention to me. He portrayed me as a troubled, estranged daughter, someone whose long years in the military had left her psychologically fragile and disconnected from reality. He even had the audacity to submit copies of the emotional emails I had written to my mother over the years, twisting my pain and loneliness into evidence of my supposed instability. To cap it all off, Megan, on cue, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I only ever wanted what's best for our family," she whispered, just loud enough for the judge to hear. The air in the room grew heavy with their lies. I could feel the judge's gaze on me, filled with a cautious pity. Then it was Jessica's turn. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. She carried no notes. She didn't need them. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and devoid of drama. "We are not here today to discuss feelings. We are here to discuss facts." A large screen flickered to life. The first image was a high-resolution scan of the forged signature on the deed transfer. "Exhibit A," Jessica stated, "a signature purported to be my client's." Then the second image appeared beside it, a screenshot of the digital metadata Kestrel had uncovered. Exhibit B, the digital fingerprint of the scan of Exhibit A, which shows it was created on a specific machine at a specific time on a network registered to the Caldwell Real Estate Agency on Main Street. I saw Megan's perfectly composed face tighten, a crack in the facade. Jessica didn't pause. Now let's follow the money. A complex flowchart filled the screen, showing the intricate path of funds from Derek's company, Vanguard Logistics, to a shell corporation in Delaware, and then directly into Megan's personal savings account. Exhibit C, a series of transactions that the prosecution will argue constitute a clear pattern of money laundering. I heard a sharp intake of breath from Megan. She was starting to breathe faster, her chest rising and falling noticeably. And finally, Your Honor, the matter of the will itself. Jessica placed a folder on the witness stand. We have a sworn affidavit from a forensic document examiner confirming that the signature on the updated will is a forgery, and we have this. She held up a single sheet of paper, a certified copy of the original will, notarized by a man who has since come forward to state he was pressured by the family to keep quiet about the subsequent fraudulent document. Their lawyer jumped to his feet, shouting objections about hearsay and relevance. But it was too late. The narrative had been shattered. The foundation of their story was turning to dust. The court would like to hear from Commander Hardin, the judge said, his voice now stern. I stood and walked to the stand. I didn't look at my family. I didn't need to feel their shock or their hatred. I had felt that my whole life. My focus was singular. I raised my right hand, swore the oath, and sat down. My uniform felt less like a costume now and more like armor. I looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, I began, my voice steady, every syllable a product of my command training. This case is about more than a house or a forged document. This case has implications for national security. A murmur went through the courtroom. I proceeded to explain in clear, concise, and unemotional terms how my professional credentials, my security clearances, my specialized knowledge in cybersecurity had been stolen and used to fraudulently obtain a sensitive defense contract. I explained how Triton Marine Solutions, a company with no real qualifications, had won a bid to supply critical components for Navy surveillance drones. These weren't just any components, Your Honor, I stated. My investigation, cross-referencing declassified procurement data with restricted serial number logs, confirms that these components match a batch reported a lost in transit during a logistical audit while I was serving in the Persian Gulf. I let that sink in. This means that stolen U.S. Navy property was being sold back to the U.S. Navy, creating a significant vulnerability in our surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. These components could have been tampered with. They could have been duplicated. They could have ended up in the hands of our adversaries. As I spoke, the main doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Two serious-looking individuals in dark suits entered and stood silently by the wall. They didn't need to show badges. I recognized them instantly. They were from the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General. I turned my head just for a moment and looked at my family. The transformation was absolute. Megan's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. My father had shrunk in his chair, his face buried in his hands. And Derek was as white as a ghost. His smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a man who has been cornered and knows there is no escape. He finally understood. They all did. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. The game was over. The aftermath of the preliminary hearing was swift and brutal. The dominoes I had lined up began to fall, not with a triumphant crash, but with the sickening, quiet finality of a collapsing structure. The story exploded across local media. Prominent Annapolis businessmen investigated for defense contract fraud. Real estate broker implicated in forgery and money laundering scheme. The headlines on the Capital Gazette's website were merciless. Derek and Megan's names, once symbols of local success, were now synonymous with scandal. I watched it unfold from the detached safety of my motel room. Leo sent me updates. Vanguard Logistics had filed for bankruptcy. Triton Marine Solutions was under federal investigation. All of their assets, bank accounts, stocks, retirement funds were frozen. The bank had put a lien on their sprawling waterfront home, the one Megan was so proud of. The friends who had once flocked to their lavish parties now crossed the street to avoid them. The empire they had built on lies, and my pain was dissolving into nothing. I felt no joy, no sense of victory, just a profound, hollow emptiness. It was the quiet after a long, brutal battle, where the silence is more deafening than the explosions. The war was over, but the cost was still being counted. Then came the phone calls, the desperate death throes of their arrogance. The first one was from Megan. Her number flashed on my screen, and I answered out of some lingering, morbid curiosity. The sharp, condescending voice was gone, replaced by a raw, hysterical shriek. "Tessa, what have you done?" she screamed, her voice cracking with sobs. "You've ruined us. You've ruined everything. They're going to take our house. What about my children? What am I supposed to tell them?" The accusations came thick and fast, a torrent of blame. She never once mentioned the fraud, the forgery, the theft. In her mind, the crime wasn't what they had done. The crime was that I had exposed them. "Are you happy now?" she wailed. "You won. You destroyed your own family." I listened to her tirade, my own heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The old Tessa would have felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of responsibility, but the woman who answered was different. "I didn't destroy it, Megan," I said, my voice calm, almost detached. "It was already rotten from the inside. I just turned on the lights." There was a stunned silence on the other end, then another wave of incoherent screaming. I didn't wait to hear it. I pressed end call, and then, with a strange sense of finality, I blocked her number. Our last conversation was over. The final confrontation came a few days later, on the cold stone steps of the courthouse. I was leaving a meeting with Jessica when I saw him waiting for me, my father. He looked a decade older, his shoulders stooped, his expensive coat hanging loosely on his shrunken frame. The confident patriarch was gone, replaced by a fragile, broken old man. "Tessa," he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. He couldn't meet my eyes. I'm sorry." The words sounded foreign coming from him. "I let Megan convince me. She said you didn't need the house, that you had the whole world. I think," he faltered, "I think I was jealous of your freedom, of your strength. It made me feel small. I was a coward." For the first time in my life, I saw tears in my father's eyes. They weren't the calculated tears of my mother, but the genuine, messy tears of regret. A part of me, the little girl who had always craved his approval, wanted to reach out, to offer some form of comfort, but I couldn't. His apology was for his feelings, not for his actions. It was about his shame, not my pain. "I can forgive your weakness, Dad," I said, and my voice was softer now, filled with a deep, aching sadness. "But I can't forgive your choices. You chose to sign that paper. You chose to betray Grandpa's promise. You chose to stand by and watch while they threw me out." He looked up then, his eyes pleading. "It doesn't have to end like this. We can still be a family." I shook my head slowly. "No, we can't." I looked at him, really looked at him. and saw a stranger. "Good luck, Dad." I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing on the stone. I did not look back. I left him there, standing alone among the pieces of the life he had helped shatter. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, and the most necessary. It was the definitive act of choosing myself, of drawing a final, unbreakable boundary. The harbor was closed for good, and I was finally, truly free. The day of the sentencing, I sat in the back of the courtroom, a quiet observer to the final act of a play I never wanted a part in. There were no news cameras this time, no clamoring reporters. The public spectacle was over. All that remained was the quiet, methodical process of justice. One by one, they stood before the judge. Derek, my brother-in-law, received 8 years in a federal prison for conspiracy to defraud the United States and money laundering. Megan, my sister, was sentenced to 6 years for her role in the fraud and forgery, and my father, Robert, for his part as a witness and facilitator, received a sentence of 10 years with no possibility of parole. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack. It was done. I felt no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of vengeance. The victory was hollow, the courtroom air thick with the ghosts of what could have been. I only felt a profound sense of quiet. A heavy chapter of my life had finally closed. I walked out of the federal courthouse into the clean, crisp Maryland air. I had won, but the victory didn't bring joy. It brought peace, and the silence in my own soul, after a lifetime of noise, was more precious than any acclamation. I remembered a quote by Maya Angelou I had read once, one that had stuck with me. "I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it." I had been changed irrevocably, but I was not reduced, I was whole. A few weeks later, the court officially returned the ownership of the Annapolis house to me. With the legal papers in hand, I drove there one last time. I parked across the street and just looked at it. The red brick glowed warmly in the afternoon sun. The white trim was bright. The gate that had once been locked against me now stood open. I could walk right in. I could reclaim my room, sleep in my old bed, and stare out at the bay from the porch where my grandfather had made his promise. But as I sat there, I realized with startling clarity that I didn't want to. That house was no longer a harbor. It was a museum of pain, haunted by the ghosts of a family I no longer had. To step inside would be to chain myself to the past I had fought so hard to escape. I picked up my phone and called Jessica. "It's done," I told her, "but I'm not moving in." I explained my decision, a plan that had been forming in my mind for days. I would sell the house. Every last penny from the sale would be used to establish the Hardin Harbor Scholarship Fund. It would be dedicated to supporting female midshipmen at the United States Naval Academy, with a preference for those from difficult family backgrounds, those who were fighting their own battles, those who were also searching for a harbor of their own. My grandfather's legacy wouldn't be in brick and mortar. It would be in the future of the women who, like me, had answered the call to serve. It would be in the opportunities I could give them, the support my own family had denied me. 1 year later, on a perfect, cloudless autumn morning, I stood on the grounds of the Naval Academy. The air was filled with the sounds of drills, the sharp commands, and the rhythmic marching of midshipmen in their crisp uniforms. I was dressed in simple civilian clothes, a navy blue sweater and jeans, feeling more at home here than I ever had in my childhood house. Beside me stood a young woman, a first-year midshipman with bright, determined eyes. She was the inaugural recipient of the Hardin Harbor Scholarship. "I don't know how to thank you, Commander," she said, her voice filled with a gratitude that felt raw and real. "This scholarship, it changed everything for me. My family, they didn't really support my decision to come here." I smiled, a genuine, easy smile. I pointed out towards the Chesapeake Bay, where the morning sun was glinting off the water, turning it into a sheet of diamonds. "The real harbor isn't the place you come from," I told her, the words feeling as true for me as I hoped they would be for her. "It's the place you decide to build. It's the mission you choose, the people who stand with you. And most importantly," I paused, placing a hand over my own heart, "it's in here." A single tear traced a path down my cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of gratitude, of peace, of a profound and quiet completion. I had lost a house, but I had found my home. I had lost a family, but I had created a legacy. I had finally, truly have found my harbor. My name is Tessa Harden, and this was my story. It took me 17 years at sea and a war in my own home to understand that your true value is never determined by the family you were born into, but by the one you build and the person you choose to become. It's a battle many of us fight in silence. If my story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear that they are not alone. Like this video and tell us in the comments below, who is your chosen family? Who is the harbor that gives you strength? Your stories matter.